You know, usually when we talk about free markets, there's this expectation of just perfect coordination, like a grand, flawless symphony.
Right. Yeah.
You have buyers, you have sellers, the price mechanism acts as the conductor, and, Adam Smith's invisible hand just points and says, there it is, equilibrium, optimal welfare for everyone.
It is a beautiful image. I mean, theoretically. The classical economic models are pristine. They assume every single cost and every benefit is perfectly captured in the price tag of a good.
But then, you step into the world of environmental economics, and suddenly that invisible hand is caught red-handed dumping toxic chemical waste into the river out back.
Exactly. The pristine model just shatters.
Right. We end up looking at a market landscape that is, quite frankly, a massive catastrophic failure. The price mechanism isn't conducting a symphony at all. It's actively hiding the true cost of doing business.
Which is really the fundamental problem we are tackling today. And this isn't just an abstract philosophical issue. For the listener joining us, mastering the mechanics of this exact market failure.
The negative externality.
Yes, and the policy instruments designed to fix it. That is the absolute core of your mission.
That's right, because you are staring down the barrel of your IES General Economics GE-03 revision, paper 3 at the DSE JNU Masters level.
That's a tough one.
It is. And this deep dive is built entirely for you. We know exactly what you're up against. Just look at the reality of the recent past year's papers, right? The 2025 IES question demanded a critical, nuanced discussion of the Pigouvian tax. And then before that, the 2024 question required a really rigorous comparative analysis between carbon taxes and cap-and-trade systems. So the examiners aren't asking for high-level summaries.
No, not at all. They want to see you pull apart these economic models, expose their theoretical assumptions, and really adjudicate between fundamentally different regulatory philosophies.
And to do that successfully, you have to build your argument from the ground up, right? Like, you cannot evaluate a policy instrument without first demonstrating a mathematical understanding of the market failure it's actually trying to correct.
Exactly. We have to start with the divergence of costs.
Okay, so let's build that foundation right now. The root of the entire discipline of environmental economics is the negative externality. Let's visualize this.
Good idea.
Imagine a massive factory producing steel. If I'm the factory owner looking at my ledger, my private marginal cost, my PMC, is essentially my supply curve.
Right.
It's the coal I burn, the iron ore I buy, the wages I pay my workers. And I am equating that PMC with the market price of steel to maximize my profit.
And from a purely private perspective, you're acting completely rationally, but your ledger is incomplete.
Because of the pollution.
Right. It is entirely ignoring the marginal external cost, the MEC, that your factory is imposing on society.
Like the asthma treatments for the town next door, or, the crop yields dropping for local farmers because of acid rain.
The degradation of the local watershed.
Yeah.
Those are uncompensated costs. So when we combine your private marginal cost with that marginal external cost, we arrive at the true social marginal cost, or SMC. Geometrically speaking, the SMC curve lies significantly above your PMC curve.
Got it.
And the vertical distance between them at any given unit of output is the exact measure of the environmental damage caused by that specific ton of steel.
So the price signal is basically lying. The free market price of steel is artificially cheap because society is secretly subsidizing it with their lungs and their ruined crops.
That's a great way to put it, yes.
And because the steel is artificially cheap, consumers demand more of it, and my factory produces way beyond the socially optimal level.
And that overproduction is the physical manifestation of the market failure. For every ton of steel produced past the intersection of the social marginal cost and the demand curve, the cost to society as a whole is actually greater than the economic benefit the consumer is getting from that steel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and if you draw this out for the exam, that creates a deadweight welfare loss triangle. It represents pure net welfare destroyed by the free market.
Right. So if the free market is essentially subsidizing asthma by hiding the cost, how does a regulator actually force that cost back onto the factory's ledger? I mean, can we just send them a bill for the damage?
In theory, yes. And that concept forms the basis of early welfare economics, which was introduced by Arthur Pigou back in 1920.
Okay.
Pigou argued that if the price signal is lying, the government must step in and correct the price through a very specific mechanism, which we call the Pigouvian tax.
But it can't just be like an arbitrary fine, right? I mean, if a local politician just slaps $1 million tax on my steel factory because they don't like the smoke, that isn't economically efficient.
No, it isn't efficient at all. To achieve the socially optimal outcome, the Pigouvian tax must be mathematically exact.
How
The
exactly?
tax rate must be set exactly equal to the marginal external damage evaluated at the socially optimal level of output.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate for a second here. Let's say the government actually manages to calculate this perfect tax. What exactly happens to my factory's supply curve?
So the government imposes the per unit tax, which effectively takes your private marginal cost curve and shifts it vertically upward by the exact amount of the tax.
Ah.
Suddenly, your private supply curve perfectly coincides with the social marginal cost curve. You are forced to internalize the externality.
So you forced me to pay for the coal, the labor, and the asthma treatments.
Exactly.
And producing that excess steel isn't profitable for me anymore. I voluntarily reduce my output to the socially optimal level, and that deadweight loss triangle is eliminated. Plus, I'm assuming the government is now collecting all this tax revenue.
Which brings us to the concept of the double dividend hypothesis.
The double dividend.
Right. The idea is that a Pigouvian tax yields two benefits. First, it corrects the environmental market failure.
Makes sense.
And second, it generates revenue that the government can use to reduce other distortionary taxes.
Like income or corporate taxes.
Exactly, thereby boosting overall economic efficiency.
Wait, but if the government gets this massive double dividend of fixing pollution and making all this money, doesn't that create a perverse incentive? I mean, if I'm the Treasury Minister, I might secretly want the pollution to continue just so I can keep collecting the tax revenue to fund my budget.
That is a very sophisticated critique, and it's a real political economy concern.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. If a government becomes reliant on pollution taxes for general revenue, it might set the tax rate too low to intentionally keep the polluting industry alive.
Yeah.
Or it might resist transitioning to completely clean, zero-emission technologies because, well, it would erode their tax base.
Right, because then the money dries up.
Exactly. But setting the political economy aside, there is a much more fundamental theoretical flaw with the Pigouvian tax that you absolutely must highlight in your exam.
The information requirement.
The information requirements are staggering. To set the optimal Pigouvian tax, the regulator requires perfect, symmetric information about the firm's marginal abatement costs and society's marginal damage costs.
I mean, I can barely figure out my own household budget. How on earth does a central planner accurately calculate the exact monetary cost of, like, a 2% drop in biodiversity or the specific long-term healthcare costs of particulate matter inhaled over 30 years?
Well, they often can't. And the consequences of guessing wrong are severe.
What happens?
If the regulator overestimates the damage and sets the tax too high, you stifle the economy. You force firms to overabate, destroying jobs and industrial capacity for an environmental benefit that doesn't economically justify the massive compliance cost.
Wow. And what if they guess too low? Which, I mean, is historically what happens due to industry lobbying, right?
Right. If the tax is too low, the firm looks at the penalty, decides it's cheaper to just pay the tax as a minor cost of doing business, and continues to pollute heavily.
So nothing changes.
Exactly. The environmental damage persists. The tax becomes merely a tool for revenue extraction rather than behavioral change.
Which is exactly why economists started looking for an alternative. If we can't figure out the perfect price for the damage, maybe we can figure out the perfect quantity of pollution we're willing to tolerate.
Yes, the quantity solution.
Right. Tradable pollution permits or cap and trade. Now, we all know the basic architecture of cap and trade, but let me put it in plain English for the listener.
Please do.
So cap and trade sets a hard limit on total pollution, right? That's the cap. It then issues permits equal to the cap and lets firms trade them. A firm that can cut pollution cheaply will cut beyond its permit requirement and sell the surplus. A firm facing high abatement costs will buy permits. The market price of permits settles where the marginal cost of abatement is equal across all firms. And this is exactly the condition for cost efficiency.
Well, perfectly stated.
But where the IES exam sets the trap is in the real-world application. Like, does this pristine theoretical market actually function in a developing economy?
It absolutely can.
Yeah.
For the exam, you should use the Surat emissions trading scheme as your primary empirical defense.
Ah, the textile mills in Gujarat.
Yeah. Yes. Launched in 2019 and extensively evaluated by researchers like Michael Greenstone, the Surat ETS was the world's first experimental particulate matter trading market. They targeted PM 2.5 emissions across over 300 highly polluting textile plants.
But how did they actually enforce the cap? Because, like you mentioned earlier, if you don't know how much a factory is polluting, the whole market is just a fiction.
The key was mandatory continuous emissions monitoring systems, or CES.
Okay.
They installed sensors directly in the smokestacks that fed real-time data back to the Gujarat Pollution Control Board. Once the monitoring infrastructure was credible, the market could function.
And what were the results? Because forcing 300 textile mills to suddenly buy pollution permits sounds like a massive economic shock.
The results actually perfectly validated the economic theory. The total particulate matter emissions dropped by roughly 24% compared to the control group.
Oh, wow.
But more importantly, because the firms could trade, the total compliance costs for the industry dropped significantly compared to the old command and control mandates. The firms with cheap technological fixes did all the heavy lifting and sold their permits, while the older, rigid plants bought them. Environmental certainty was achieved at the lowest possible aggregate cost.
That is a phenomenal case study. But here is the critical analytical jump you need to make for the exam. Both a perfectly set Pigouvian tax and a perfectly functioning cap-and-trade system achieve the exact same cost efficiency.
Correct.
They both equate marginal abatement costs across firms. So if you're the regulator, how do you mathematically choose between a price instrument and a quantity instrument?
This is arguably the most important technical concept of the entire syllabus. We're talking about Martin Weitzman's 1974 theorem on prices versus quantities.
Right.
Weitzman proved that under conditions of perfect information, taxes and permits are perfectly equivalent. But as we've established, regulators operate under profound uncertainty regarding the true marginal costs of abatement.
Wait, let's proxy the listener's mental whiteboard for a second. We have to visualize this geometry. The choice between a tax and a permit under uncertainty depends entirely on the relative slopes of our curves.
Right. Let's walk through it.
Huh?
Imagine a graph. We have our marginal cost of abatement curve and our marginal benefit of abatement curve. And remember, the marginal benefit of abating pollution is the exact same thing as avoiding the marginal damage of pollution.
Okay, got it. Scenario 1. The marginal benefit, the damage curve, is relatively flat compared to the marginal cost curve. Why does Weitzman say a tax is preferred here?
Think about what a flat damage curve means in the real world. It means that while the pollutant is harmful, an extra ton of it doesn't suddenly trigger an ecological collapse. The incremental damage is steady and mild. Yeah. But the cost of cleaning it up is steep and uncertain. If you use a strict cap-and-trade system and you underestimate how incredibly expensive it is for firms to install scrubbers, the permit price will violently skyrocket.
Because the supply of permits is perfectly inelastic. It's a vertical line. If demand for permits shifts outward because abatement is harder than we thought, the price goes to the moon.
Exactly. And the economic cost of that mistake, forcing firms to spend billions of dollars to cut those last few tons of a relatively mild pollutant, results in a massive deadweight loss.
Right.
It is much worse than the relatively minor harm of a little extra pollution. In this scenario, a tax is better because it acts as a safety valve. It puts a strict ceiling on compliance costs. If abatement turns out to be shockingly expensive, firms just pay the tax. The economy is protected.
But what if we flip the geometry? What if the marginal cost curve of abatement is flat, but the marginal damage curve is incredibly steep?
Then you must use a quantity instrument. You must use cap and trade.
Give me a real-world example of a steep damage curve.
Climate tipping points. Or, the accumulation of radioactive waste or toxic heavy metals in a local water supply.
Oh, scary stuff.
Very. In these scenarios, the environment can absorb a certain baseline amount of the pollutant with relatively little damage. But if you cross a specific threshold, say raising global temperatures past 2 degrees Celsius, or poisoning the watershed beyond its natural filtration capacity, the environmental damage spikes exponentially. The curve becomes nearly vertical.
It's a catastrophic threshold.
Yes. If you use a tax in a tipping point scenario and you miscalculate even slightly, the results are devastating. If the tax is just a little too low, firms will choose to pay the tax, the pollution will breach the threshold, and you trigger irreversible ecological catastrophe.
Because the deadweight loss of being wrong on the quantity is practically infinite.
Therefore, you use permits. You impose a hard, immovable cap to physically prevent the system from crossing the threshold, prioritizing environmental certainty over price certainty.
That is brilliant. Okay, so steep damage curve, cap it to avoid catastrophe. Flat damage curve, tax it to protect the economy. But if these market instruments are so elegant, so heavily researched, Why is it that when I look at actual environmental law, so much of it isn't taxes or trading markets? It's just like massive books of rules.
Well, you're identifying the gap between economic theory and regulatory reality. For decades, the default approach for governments was command and control regulation, often abbreviated as CAC.
Right.
Instead of tweaking price incentives and letting the market figure it out, the regulator acts as an engineer. They mandate specific technology, decreeing that every single coal plant must install a specific flue gas desulfurization scrubber, or they set uniform emission performance standards, dictating that no facility can emit more than 50 units of sulfur dioxide, period.
If I can use an analogy here, the command and control approach is like a doctor looking at a marathon runner and a couch potato and ordering them both to run exactly 5 miles every day to improve public health. The marathon runner doesn't get any fitter, and the couch potato has a heart attack. It's completely blind to individual capacity.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the core economic critique of COC. Command and control regulations are fundamentally inefficient because they ignore the heterogeneity of firms.
The differences.
Right. Different firms have vastly different marginal abatement costs based on their age, their technology, and their location.
Like an older, heavily polluting cement factory from the 1970s might have to spend 10 times as much capital to cut 1 ton of emissions compared to a brand new, highly efficient factory right down the road. But the uniform standard forces them both to hit the exact same target.
It forces high-cost abaters to spend massive, inefficient amounts of capital, while low-cost abaters stop reducing emissions the exact second they hit the legal limit, even if they could have easily and cheaply reduced their emissions further.
Which creates what economists call a compliance ceiling.
Exactly. Command and control offers zero dynamic incentive to innovate. Once a firm complies with the technological mandate or hits the emission target, their incentive to invest in research and development for cleaner technology drops to absolute zero.
Right, there's no reward.
There is no financial reward for overcompliance. Market instruments, conversely, provide a continuous financial reward. Under a tax, every single ton of pollution you eliminate saves you money. Under cap and trade, every ton you eliminate frees up a valuable permit you can sell to a competitor.
But I want to be fair to the policymakers here, because market instruments don't just have to be massive, complex carbon markets or sweeping national taxes. There are targeted, highly effective market instruments like deposit refund systems.
Oh, definitely. Deposit refund systems are a very elegant application of Pigouvian principles, particularly useful for solid waste management, where illegal dumping is the primary externality.
Think about extended producer responsibility, or EPR, which India is heavily utilizing right now for plastic waste and e-waste. As a consumer, you pay a surcharge up front when you buy a toxic product, like a car battery or a glass bottle.
Right.
But you receive a refund upon proper disposal at an approved facility.
It is brilliant because it internalizes the externality of waste disposal without requiring a massive centralized monitoring apparatus. The financial incentive physically drives the pollution back to the source for recycling.
Right.
It makes illegal dumping an irrational economic choice.
But let's bring theory back down to earth for a moment. Let's look at the political economy. Because these pristine economic models, auctioning permits, levying optimal taxes, they often get completely mangled by the political process before they ever become law.
Regulatory failure is just as prevalent as market failure. Let's look at cap and trade again. In a theoretically perfect world, the government would auction the pollution permits to the highest bidder, generating revenue just like a tax. But in reality, how are permits usually distributed when a new market is formed?
Oh, they use grandfathering. They look at the biggest, dirtiest polluters, look at their historical emissions, and just hand them the permits for free.
They do it to buy off political opposition. If you threaten to charge heavy industry for pollution they used to emit for free, they will lobby to kill the legislation, so the government bribes them with free permits.
But that completely violates the polluter pays principle. It creates massive windfall profits for the very companies that caused the environmental crisis in the first place, and it sacrifices the public revenue that could have been used to reduce distortionary taxes.
It is a massive compromise of economic efficiency for political feasibility. Furthermore, if we look at the context of developing nations, which is heavily emphasized in the Indian Economic Survey, these elegant market schemes often collapse due to weak state capacity.
The MRV problem: measurement, reporting, and verification.
If a regulatory body lacks the funding, the technology, or the uncorrupted personnel to accurately monitor emissions at the smokestack, the entire market breaks down.
Obviously.
If a firm is legally capped at 100 tons, but they know they can bribe an inspector or a camper with a sensor to only report 50 tons, they will never buy a permit. The market price collapses to zero. In environments with weak MRV infrastructure, a crude but easily verifiable command and control mandate, like physically verifying that a scrubber is bolted to a smokestack, might actually be the most effective practical option, despite its theoretical economic inefficiency.
It's a sobering reminder that our equations rely on the assumption of the rule of law. But speaking of evaluating government interventions, let's look at how the state operates when it isn't just regulating private firms, but when it is the one building massive infrastructure. I'm talking about dams, national highways, power plants.
Yes.
How does an economist decide if a massive state project is actually beneficial for society?
They utilize social cost benefit analysis, or SCBA. This is a critical departure from private financial accounting. A private developer only cares about the direct financial revenues and the direct capital costs. A government must calculate the net present value, the NPV, by quantifying and monetizing all the positive and negative externalities that private markets ignore.
So, if the state is building a massive hydroelectric dam, they don't just calculate the cost of the concrete and the revenue from selling electricity. They have to mathematically monetize the negative externality of displacing indigenous communities, the loss of the forest ecosystem, and perhaps the positive spillover effect of flood control downstream.
They attempt to capture the total change in social welfare. But SCBA contains what is arguably the most fiercely debated, ethically fraught mathematical decision in all of environmental economics: the selection of the discount rate.
Let's really dig into this, because discounting is essentially how economists value the future compared to the present. If I have a private financial project, I use a private discount rate based on the market interest rates, say 8, 10, or 12%. But if we use a standard 10% private discount rate to evaluate an environmental project, aren't we basically stating that the future of the planet is mathematically worthless?
You have hit the exact center of the controversy. Let's look at the pure compound interest math. If you discount future environmental benefits or future ecological damages at a private market rate of 10%, anything that happens 50 or 100 years from now mathematically approaches zero in today's present value terms.
So if a highway project creates a tiny economic boom today, but the emissions from that highway trigger a localized ecological collapse 60 years from now, a high discount rate shrinks that future collapse to a fraction of a penny. The project gets the green light.
It heavily biases investment toward projects with immediate payoffs and pushes the catastrophic costs onto unborn generations. This is why environmental economists argue fiercely for a much lower social discount rate.
A social discount rate.
Yes, a social discount rate incorporates intergenerational equity. It asserts that society, as a continuous entity, should value the welfare of future generations much more highly than a private mortal investor values a stock portfolio return 50 years out.
So if you use a very low social discount rate, say 1 or 2% suddenly, long-term sustainability investments like massive reforestation projects or climate mitigation infrastructure become mathematically viable. The massive benefits they provide a century from now retain their mathematical weight.
The choice of the discount rate, often debated using the Ramsey equation, which factors in pure time preference and the expected elasticity of future wealth, is where pure economic math meets profound moral philosophy. It is how we quantify our ethical obligation to our grandchildren.
That is heavy. We are using a decimal point to decide the fate of future generations. Now, I want to take a massive pivot. So far, our entire discussion has assumed that the government must be the savior.
Sure.
The government taxes, the government caps, the government evaluates. What if the government just got out of the way entirely?
This brings us to a revolutionary framework introduced by Ronald Coase in his seminal 1960 paper, The Problem of Social Cost, for which he ultimately won the Nobel Prize. Coase completely upended the Pigouvian consensus. The Coase theorem states that if property rights are perfectly defined, and if individuals act rationally, private bargaining will lead to a socially efficient outcome, regardless of who initially holds the property rights.
Okay, let's test this with the classic example. Let's say there is a railway line running through farmland. The old steam trains throw sparks, and those sparks occasionally set fire to the farmer's crops. A classic negative externality.
Right.
Under Pigou, we would beg the government to tax the railway. How does Coase solve it?
Coase says we just need the court to clearly define who owns the right. Let's look at the first scenario. The farmer has the legal right to a fire-free field.
The railway is legally liable, so the railway will look at the cost of installing spark arresters on their trains. If the spark arrestor is cheaper than paying the farmer for the burned crops, the railway installs the technology.
Right.
If the crops are cheap and the spark arrestor is incredibly expensive, the railway just pays the farmer for the damage.
Exactly. Yeah. Now let's reverse the property rights. Scenario 2. The court rules that the railway has the absolute legal right to throw as many sparks as they want.
Well, if I'm the farmer, I'm losing thousands of dollars in crops. So I will literally walk over to the railway company and offer to pay them out of my own pocket to install the spark arresters. I will pay them up to the total value of my destroyed crops. If the arrestor is cheaper than the crop damage, the deal happens.
Notice the outcome. In both scenarios, the spark arrestor gets installed if and only if it is economically efficient to do so. The initial assignment of property rights dictates who pays whom. It changes the wealth distribution, but it does not change the final, electively efficient level of the externality. The private actors internalize the externality entirely on their own, no government tax required.
That is a staggering theoretical insight.
Yep.
But let's look out the window. We have massive industrial polluters pumping chemicals into rivers and carbon into the atmosphere. I don't see communities of citizens walking up to coal plants and privately bargaining a socially optimal level of sulfur dioxide. Why does this elegant theorem fail so spectacularly in modern environmental crises?
Because of the silent assumption carrying the entire weight of the theorem: zero transaction costs. And this is the binding constraint you must emphasize in the exam.
The cost of actually making the deal happen.
Exactly. Coasian bargaining works beautifully for two neighbors arguing over a noisy fence. The transaction costs are negligible. You lean over the fence and make a deal. But environmental externalities are rarely between two isolated parties. They are diffuse.
Think about air pollution or a degraded watershed. You have millions of affected citizens. The transaction costs become insurmountable. First, you have information costs. How do you prove exactly which of the 10 factories along the river caused your specific illness?
Then you have massive negotiation and coordination costs. How do you organize 2 million affected citizens to bargain collectively without falling victim to the free rider problem, where everyone waits for someone else to pay the factory to stop polluting?
And finally, enforcement costs. Even if you make a deal, how do the citizens afford the continuous legal and monitoring fees to ensure the factory doesn't just take the money and secretly dump the waste at night?
When transaction costs are high, the Coase theorem completely breaks down. The private bargaining fails, the negative externality persists, and the market remains in failure. And that breakdown is the ultimate justification for why we must return to government intervention through the Pigouvian taxes, the cap-and-trade permits, or the command and control regulations we explore today. Coase provides a brilliant theoretical benchmark, but for large-scale, diffuse environmental issues, the transaction costs are simply prohibitive.
This has been an incredible journey. Let's crystallize this for the listener. We started with the foundational market failure, the wedge between private and social marginal costs creating deadweight loss.
We certainly did.
We explored Pigou's attempt to fix the price signal with a tax, but found it severely limited by the massive information requirements needed to accurately price marginal damage. We analyzed cap and trade as the quantity alternative, seeing how it guarantees an environmental target while allowing the market to find the lowest marginal abatement cost, as proven by the Surratt ETS.
Right.
We dove into Weitzman's theorem, learning to choose a tax when the damage curve is flat to cap compliance costs, and choosing permits when the damage curve is steep to avoid catastrophic tipping points. We contrasted these market instruments with the rigid, innovation-stifling nature of command and control regulations. We waded into the ethical mathematics of SCBA and the social discount rate. And finally, we tested the Coase theorem, discovering that transaction costs are the ultimate deal breaker for private environmental bargaining.
That is a comprehensive master's-level framework. But let's translate that framework into direct exam strategy. Based on the syllabus and the trajectory of the 2024 and 2025 papers, here is your 2026 IES cheat sheet. These are the 3 core comparative patterns you must be ready to execute.
Pattern 1. The ultimate showdown. Be prepared to compare a Pigouvian tax directly against cap and trade.
Do not just list their definitions. Compare them on 3 axes: efficiency, equity, and information. Explicitly contrast the massive information requirement of perfectly pricing the tax against the quantity certainty of the permit system. And be sure to bring in the political economy of permit allocation auctioning versus grandfathering.
Pattern 2. Weitzman's choice under uncertainty.
If the exam gives you a scenario with uncertain abatement costs, you must immediately reference Weitzman. Be ready to explain the geometry. Remember the rule. If the marginal benefit of abatement curve is flat, Argue for a tax to prevent volatile compliance costs. If the marginal cost curve is flat and the damage curve is steep, argue for permits to prevent an ecological threshold breach. It is all about minimizing the deadweight loss of regulatory error.
And to pattern 3, the Coase theorem as a theoretical foil.
State the strict conditions required for coasts to work perfectly defined property rights, rational actors, and crucially, zero transaction costs. Then, pivot to explain explicitly why real-world transaction costs, information gathering, massive multi-party coordination, and enforcement cause private bargaining to fail for diffuse environmental externalities requiring state intervention.
Keep those 3 analytical frameworks sharp, and you will dominate the GE-03 paper. But before we let you go back to your notes, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over. It builds on everything we've analyzed today, but it challenges the boundaries of the economic models themselves.
It is always valuable to question the underlying philosophy of the math.
Exactly. Throughout this entire deep dive, in every model we looked at, the socially optimal level of pollution is almost never zero.
That's true.
The optimal point is where the marginal cost of cleaning up the last ton equals the marginal benefit of doing so. Because reducing pollution to absolute zero is usually infinitely expensive, the economic model always accepts a certain efficient level of environmental degradation. But if the optimal level of pollution is never zero in economic theory, how do we morally reconcile that efficient level of damage with the fundamental right of a community to a completely clean, unpolluted environment? Just because the invisible hand is finally paying the doctor bills, does that make it okay to keep dumping the sludge?
That is the enduring friction between cold economic efficiency and fundamental environmental justice. A perfect question to ponder as you master the material.
Keep questioning the models. Good luck with your revision. We will catch you on the next deep dive.